Evening. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jamie Boskett. I'm the president and CEO here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, and I'm overjoyed to see you all. This is our first evening lecture in just months and months, so this is just wonderful. In fact, I was just counting before. It's been almost exactly 21 months since our last evening program here at the museum. Yeah, it's exciting to be back, and we've all come through a lot together. So I'm happy to see so many familiar faces, and thank you for being here. Being here in our Robbins Family Forum, which is, I think, one of the best venues in the state for this sort of history programming. And tonight we have a wonderful, wonderful speaker, and I will mention that in just a moment. First, I do want to express that, well, we missed seeing all of you in person. I want you to know that we have been working tirelessly here. And you probably saw that just looking at the building when you arrived tonight. But we have been working tirelessly in support of this important institution and its story in finding ways to do our job in greater, far-reaching ways. With greater purpose and perspective, we have charted what I think is a really thoughtful path through this daunting time. It has allowed us to serve an even greater number of people, believe it or not, through digital means. This is a path that also allowed us to be one of the very few organizations of our size in this country that avoided not a single COVID-related furlough, layoff, staff cut of any kind. In fact, our team has been dedicated towards the future planning for this work that's underway here at the museum. This path has allowed us also to deeply invest in this moment at a period of disruption towards a brighter future. And so you've seen the work happening. This is part of the most expansive renovation and reimagination in our very long history. Believe it or not, we are now halfway through. We are halfway to the finish line. And most of this we've been able to accomplish at a time when visitors couldn't be here anyways. So I want to thank all of you for being such stalwart supporters. The reason we were able to maintain our staff, the reason we were able to invest in our future is because of our members. And to have our membership stick with us through this time, looking forward to that promising day when we could all be back together and we could be learning and enjoying each other's company, it's really a very, very special thing. This, I think, is very much a history-making moment. A history-making moment for this place that has rich history. But we are building on all the great work that's been done over generations, the great work by many, building on that foundation to build the museum that we want for the future, the museum we want when we turn 200 as an institution, which is right around the corner, the museum that we want when our country turns 250, which is even sooner. So we're investing in the future at a time when I think history education is absolutely of utmost importance. So I thank you for that. This evening, we are pleased to present the 10th annual lecture in the Hazel and Fulton Chauncey lecture series. Hazel and Fulton Chauncey were longtime VHS members who had a special interest in the scholarly work of this institution. Their sons, Edwin Hall and Warren Fulton Chauncey, established this lecture series as a way to encourage the same appreciation for history and history education in others, particularly in young people. I'm so pleased that Warren is with us tonight, and I'd like to ask him if he would to stand up so we can all show him our collective gratitude for his investment in history. Thank you, Warren. I'd also like to recognize with us this evening our President Emeritus, Dr. Charlie Bryan, and his wife, Cammie, who are with us. Thank you both. Having had the opportunity to get to know Charlie over these 5 years now, nearly, that I have been here, when I mention about building on the foundation, the great groundwork laid, his vision just pops into my head. I can see him. So thank you, Charlie. We're also joined by nearly all members of our Board of Trustees this evening, including our chair, Pam Royal, and our vice chair, Richard Cullen. So if you'd all just wave so we could recognize you. Thank you. Tonight's speaker is a particularly special one for us here at the museum. William C. Jack Davis is a renowned history professor who taught at Virginia Tech. An acclaimed expert on the Civil War, he's served on a number of advisory boards, including the Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission, the Civil War Preservation Trust, the Museum of the Civil War Soldier in Petersburg, the National Park Service, and the Lincoln Prize and Pulitzer Prize nominating juries. He is the author and editor, believe this, of 50 books, including the subject of tonight's lecture, The Greatest Fury, the Battle of New Orleans, and the Rebirth of America. I want to end by saying that I'm particularly proud to note that Jack now serves here on the Historical Society's Board of Trustees. So we're so thrilled to have him with us this evening. Again, I want to thank you all for your wonderful support of this place at a time of growth and transformation when it's needed most. So thank you all. If you would please join me in a very warm welcome for Jack Davis.
Thank you, Jamie, and thanks to all of you for coming. In just about 2 months, I turned 75. I was feeling kind of aged until I heard about this outfit approaching its 200th birthday. And of course, the nation is approaching its 250th. I'm feeling rather sprightly now as a result. I'm delighted to be here. It's great to see all of you. Charlie Bryan, good Lord, thank you for coming. I remember when you were a child and I was publishing articles you wrote. And 50 years ago, yeah, you look real good now. I'd like to thank the Virginia Museum of History and Culture for inviting me to be here, the Chaunceys for sponsoring this lecture series. I'd especially like to thank this organization for letting me do this in person as opposed to via this thing called Zoom, which I wish I had bought stock in 18 months ago, but I hope never to hear of it again. There is no experience more stultifying than giving a lecture on Zoom. It's dreadful. I mean, one good thing about it is you can give a lecture with your pants down and nobody notices. But I have always found you get a lot more laughs if you do that in front of a live audience. And it also reminds me of something when I grew up in Sonoma County, California, about 50 miles north of San Francisco, in the redwood and now the wine country. In the late 50s, early 60s, there was a very popular hot or cooked cereal out there called Zoom. Has anybody here ever heard of Zoom cereal? It had mystical properties. You could eat it as a cereal if you wanted to do that. You could also use it to make a pie crust. You could use it to make paper mache artworks. And if you had a leak in your automobile radiator, 2 tablespoons of Zoom in the water would close the leak. So to me, Zoom always means something much different than what the Zoom thing is. But happily, I'm here in front of you in person. But I will assure you that if your radiator leaks, my lecture might actually stop it up. We were just discussing in the board meeting today aspects of our history and the way Americans approach their history that include such things as mythology. Most of us tend to think that myth is only something that happened to the ancient Romans or the ancient Greeks. But mythology is all around us every day and always has been. It is a human phenomenon. That is to say, what you may choose to believe, perhaps as opposed to what you ought to believe. Myth has a great deal to say about we ourselves, how we want to see ourselves, how we want the world to see us. And myths aren't necessarily lies. There's usually some grain of truth at the basis of most myth, but it says so much about who all peoples are as members of their separate cultures. I find it fascinating to study. I spent years studying Civil War mythology, believe it or not. There's a lot of mythology about the Civil War. But you find it in every other aspect of our history, as I did in doing some work on what is incorrectly called the Battle of New Orleans. Now, everybody knows something about the Battle of New Orleans, even if it's wrong. What many know is thanks to an Arkansas history teacher in the 1950s named James Morris. He wrote songs about historical events, humorous songs about historical events, to try to keep his high school students interested and entertained. Good luck to him. I've tried it. In 1958, he wrote one based on an old fiddle tune titled The 8th of January. Morris later performed that song publicly under the name of Jimmy Driftwood. And in 1959, Johnny Horton recorded it, now titled The Battle of New Orleans. I see eyebrows being raised. Rest easy, I am not about to sing it, though my singing will also clog radiators. But most of you will recognize the lyric. In 1814, we took a little trip along with Colonel Jackson down the mighty Mississippi. We took a little bacon and we took a little beans, and we caught the bloody British in the town of New Orleans. Driftwood didn't let facts interfere with entertainment. I don't either. As when he had the Americans fighting from behind cotton bales, a persistent myth. They did not. There were no cotton bales in their defenses. But he did imbue the song with some of the mythic humor and comic exaggeration so popular in early America and which is still associated with the battle today, as when he wrote, again I shall not sing, "We fired our cannon till the barrel melted down. So we grabbed an alligator and we fought another round. We filled his head with cannonballs and powdered his behind. And when we touched the powder off, the gator lost his mind." That would shake your day up too if it happened to you. Hard as it is to believe when we consider what tops the popular music charts today, in 1959, Horton's recording rose to #1 on the charts. It won 2 Grammy Awards, one for the Best Country Western Song and the other for Best Song of the Year. It was later recorded by artists like Dolly Parton, Johnny Cash, and the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band, along with about 30 or 40 others. Other things Americans in the street know about the Battle of New Orleans are that the Americans were heavily outnumbered, that the odds were all with the British, that the deadly rifle fire from Tennessee and Kentucky marksmen won the day, and that the battle was fought after the War of 1812 was over, and it really didn't matter. Well, with history, as with politics, be careful of what everyone knows. For a start, the British did not come to conquer. They didn't want what came to be called the War of 1812. They were already heavily engaged on the continent with Napoleon. A conflict in North America would be a distraction and a drain on their depleted treasury. But America's growing merchant trade with Britain's allies and alliances with France posed a threat to Britain's ultimate success against Bonaparte. Consequently, when President James Monroe declared war, James Buchanan wouldn't have declared war on anybody. When Madison declared war in 1812, Britain accepted the challenge, but at no time contemplated conquering the United States or returning it to colonial status. Its objective in the campaigns that followed was to keep the Americans from expanding across the country, and especially to keep them from interfering with Canada. Only when Napoleon was beaten in 1814 did Whitehall turn real attention to the New World War. After capturing Washington in August, the Redcoats needed to maintain momentum, and a blow aimed at America's soft underbelly on the Gulf Coast suited the purpose. It could decoy Tennessee and Kentucky volunteers away from the Northeast, where they were causing a big problem for the British. And they made the war very difficult for them there. If successful, they could also put the Louisiana Territory in play. Many thought France did not legitimately own Louisiana when Napoleon sold it to Jefferson, but that instead it still rightfully belonged to Spain. Take Louisiana and hand it back to Spain, and Britain would block Yankee expansion west of the Mississippi and put the lucrative port of New Orleans in the hands of an ally. Britain and America were in fact holding peace negotiations at the time. It was possible, even likely, that peace terms might be concluded before a campaign could come to fruition. But it took up to 2 months. This is important to remember about that time. It took up to 2 months for news from Belgium to get to the Gulf of Mexico because it traveled so slowly. Sadly, there was no Twitter or TikTok or Facebook or any of these other things that I know absolutely nothing about. What if the Redcoats captured New Orleans, only to find afterward that the war had already concluded? Never mind, said the Ministry of War in London. Go ahead and attack. They would deal with the finer points of diplomacy later. Consequently, by mid-December 1814, a huge British fleet with thousands of soldiers, armaments, and munitions of war was off the Louisiana coast. Many of those men were veterans of the campaigns in Spain and elsewhere against Napoleon. They were some of the best soldiers Britain had. Destined to command them was a young officer of great distinction, Sir Edward Pakenham, protege and brother-in-law of the Duke of Wellington. New Orleans might very well be his career capstone. The American army that was destined to defend New Orleans was a remarkable affair. Once complete, it included United States regulars, that is, professional soldiers, Tennessee, Kentucky, Mississippi, and Louisiana volunteers, 600 men of the 1st and 2nd battalions of free men of color from New Orleans, several battalions of Creoles, one made up entirely of French nationals, a company of Choctaw volunteers, a company of Irishmen, and a smattering of Spaniards and Englishmen. In its complexion, it was truly the first American army we have ever fielded. Command went to Andrew Jackson, a major general of Tennessee militia already known as Old Hickory. He made his reputation by winning a few battles with the Creeks, in which he heavily outnumbered them. There was hardly any doubt as to the outcome of those battles, but it's a good way to become a military hero, nevertheless. His dominance over command in the region was cemented, and that put him in command of defending New Orleans. One of the wonderful things about this group of men who went down there is that it's kind of a gathering of frontier folk heroes. Jackson's most trusted scout was a man named Reuben Kemper, a household name in 1814, though no one remembers him today. He was a giant of a man, a redhead from Ohio who had moved down to Louisiana into what was then known as Spanish West Florida in 1807, whereupon he and his 2 brothers made it their personal mission to take that part of Louisiana away from Spain. They were a constant thorn in Spain's side. In 1810, they helped to foment and lead the shortest revolution in our history. By my estimation, it lasted about 38 seconds, in which they captured Baton Rouge, which was the capital of Spanish West Florida, and thereupon they immediately declared the Free Republic of West Florida. They had their own flag, a blue flag with a single star, symbol of independence, which would later be used in Texas. And of course, in 1861, the Bonnie Blue flag will fly at the head of many Confederate regiments. Another man there, one of Jackson's favorite couriers, was Major Sam Dale, veteran of the legendary 1813 canoe fight, when he and 3 companions stood in a canoe in the Alabama River and used their clubbed muskets to kill 8 out of 9 attacking warriors who were fighting from their own canoes. Then there was Captain Nathaniel Pryor of the 44th United States Infantry. He had been with Lewis and Clark's Corps of Discovery. He had seen the great Western Sea, probably the only man there who had. 2 brothers from Avoyelles Parish out west of the river in Louisiana were rushing to join Jackson virtually as the battle was being fought. One was named Reason Bowie, who of course is credited with being the inventor of a rather distinctive kind of American knife. And with him was his younger brother James, not yet a legendary frontiersman, but destined to be one in the years left to him before his apotheosis at the Alamo. A sergeant in the 7th United States Infantry, Isham Lewis, was Thomas Jefferson's nephew. Likely he kept that to himself, however. 3 years earlier, he and a brother got drunk, and when an enslaved man accidentally broke a pitcher in their cabin, they attacked him with an axe and cut him to pieces. The brother killed himself. Lewis escaped from jail and fled west, where at the outbreak of war he enlisted, perhaps, I suppose, with the hope of redeeming himself. There were also the famed and feared Baratarians, privateers and smugglers, loosely associated under the leadership of the brothers Jean and Pierre Lafitte. They were not pirates. They were really businessmen. Illegal businessmen, but they were still businessmen. Pierre would serve as a scout and a guide for Jackson, while Jean, who looked nothing like Yul Brynner, guarded several back doors to New Orleans through the bayous and the lakes south of the city. There were even, as I mentioned earlier, a few Englishmen in Jackson's command, one of them not himself destined for fame, but surely to be fame adjacent. Captain Charles Wollstonecraft was still a British citizen, but he was enlisted in the American Army as a major of artillery. He had a niece in England named Mary Wollstonecraft. 2 years from now, she would marry the poet Percy Shelley. Even before that, she was already at work on a book that she subtitled The Modern Prometheus, but we all know it better as Frankenstein. When the opposing armies met, it was not in the Battle of New Orleans. Rather, they met in a series of 7 engagements that almost from the start demonstrated that despite fear and expectation, the odds were almost all in the Americans' favor. Of those 7 engagements, the British won only 1, the Americans the other 6. The first was the Battle of Lake Borgne on December 14, 1814. If any of you ever read those great C.S. Forester novels about Horatio Hornblower, this was an episode straight out of the Hornblower novels. A little American fleet of gunboats put itself in the path of half a dozen British warships who disgorged their soldiers into boats that then rowed into the American fleet and boarded and attacked them and captured the entire American squadron. It was a win for the British, but one thing it did was hold them up for at least a day, maybe 2. After that, in a brilliant amphibious operation, the advanced British regiment successfully got through the bayous below New Orleans and managed unseen, undetected, passing through an area that even the Americans didn't know very well and that they didn't think anybody could get through. But the British did it. And they reached the road to New Orleans on December 23rd, with the American defenders absolutely gone. There were none there. The road to the city was completely open to them, 10 miles away. Almost certainly they could have taken the city, but their commander decided to stop and wait till more reinforcements came up, and unfortunately lost the opportunity for one of the most brilliant victories the British would ever have won. When he learned of the threat, Andrew Jackson responded typically by launching a forced march down the road with whatever he could find at hand, and then launched a surprise attack in the dark that was a confused mess for both sides and a tactical draw. But the British advanced no further, and the city was saved. Score 1 for the Americans. Jackson used the time thus purchased to erect a defensive line below the city, capitalizing on the first of several factors that were heavily in his favor. Only one road led along the north bank of the Mississippi, and the dry ground for maneuvering an army extended barely 1,000 yards from the river back to an impenetrable cypress swamp. The British had to come that way. There was no other way to approach the city. Jackson employed soldiers, citizens, shopkeepers, free blacks, enslaved people from surrounding plantations, and a host of others to deepen a canal that stretched between the river and the swamp. And then everything they dug out of the canal, they threw behind it and began building a wall of mud that would eventually rise to 10 and even 12 feet in height in places. He then cut openings in that wall for artillery with guns trained point blank to cover the narrow ground of the Chalmette plantation in front of them, which any British advance was going to have to cross. Those batteries were another stroke of luck for Jackson. The United States Navy had a naval base in New Orleans. Over the years leading up to this, Washington had sent a powerhouse of heavy naval guns to New Orleans to be emplaced on ships that were to be built there. The ships didn't get built. So the Navy Yard had all of these heavy guns and all the ammunition for them sitting there idle. In a remarkable example of intra-service cooperation, Jackson began to ask the naval commander for guns, and he gave Jackson everything he wanted. So for day after day after day, heavy naval guns are being hauled from the Navy Yard out to the mud wall. And before you know it, Jackson eventually would have 8 batteries with about 16 heavy cannon in them, all trained on that road up which the British would have to advance. When General Pakenham launched a heavy reconnaissance on December 28th to test the strength of that line, the artillery easily drove the Redcoats back before the infantry even got within musket range. Score another win for the Yankees. I'm using Yankees in the 1815 version of the term rather than that from 50 years later and nothing to do with baseball. By New Year's Day, 1815, Pakenham had virtually all of his artillery in hand and believed he was ready to punch holes in the wall the Americans called Line Jackson. He's a veteran of campaigns in Spain and elsewhere where forts were made out of stone and brick. And the way to beat a hole in stone or brick is to fire heavy, solid cannonballs at it, and you crush the masonry until you open a hole. Somehow he thought this was going to work against a wall made out of mud. Then after he punched those holes in it, his infantry would push through to rout the Yankee army and march on the city. What he discovered instead, of course, you've already guessed. Jackson's mud wall just swallowed cannonballs like they were M&Ms. They easily absorbed even the exploding shot. There were a few of those that Pakenham had. They just sank into the mud, went boom, and nothing happened. As a result, Pakenham called off his infantry assault even before it got started. Score one more win for the Americans. Now he faced a dilemma. Having come so far, it was hard to turn back. This is not anything unique to Pakenham. Many generals face this. His army, the Duke of Wellington, and people back in England were expecting a victory. Abandoning the campaign without one major battle was not an option. Consequently, he planned a very well-conceived effort for January 8th, 1815. The bulk of his army would make a pre-dawn assault on Jackson's line, trusting to darkness to cover the men until they reached that deep canal in front of the wall. Other parties would go ahead of them to throw bundles of sticks and mud and bales of hay and anything else they could find into that canal to fill it up enough that soldiers could walk across that and then use scaling ladders to climb up the wall and go over the top and rout the Americans. Well, you can guess what happened. The great military theorist, Karl von Clausewitz, once wrote in one of his books on military strategy that a commander thinks and schemes and plans and gets every detail just right so that everything is going to go perfectly. And then the moment he says go, the machine starts to break down. And he spends the rest of his time just trying to deal with the screw-ups and the mistakes. And unfortunately, that's, for Pakenham's point of view, that's what happened to him. At the same time, having had his men dig a canal from those bayous behind him, across behind his lines to the river, he planned to send more soldiers across the river in boats that would pass down that canal to the south bank, and they would push their way up the south bank while the rest of the army on the north bank pushed its way up. And if they could, perhaps they could actually, the south bank contingent might actually push all the way up opposite New Orleans, the city itself, whereupon the boats that had brought them over would come upriver, meet them, and ferry them across to New Orleans, take the city. And even if Jackson was still successfully holding out down on his mud line, his line of retreat would be cut off. He'd have no choice but to disperse his army. Well, it was very well planned, as I said, but it all went wrong. By this time, Pakenham had as many as about 10,000 men in hand. But contrary to popular misconception, Jackson actually had upwards of 12,000 men to defend New Orleans. Many had just arrived. Hundreds had no arms. Thousands of them never even got into the battle. It just didn't matter. The decisive element was that wall of mud. There was no way around it on the river end, and there was little chance of getting through the swamp at the other end. It was no more than about 5,000 feet in length. It was too narrow for Pakenham to take advantage of his numbers, and Jackson himself could barely get more than 3,000 men onto that wall. So the other 9,000 he had just were kind of behind the lines as spectators. No sooner did Pakenham launch the attack, as I said, than everything began to go wrong. In the darkness, his regiments got confused. They encountered unexpected ditches and fences they hadn't noticed before. The men carrying the bundles of sticks and other things to fill the moat took them to the wrong places or just dropped them in the field and ran. But all the while, those 8 batteries of American artillery just kept firing one exploding shell after another at the advancing columns. It was literally fish in a barrel. In every salvo, Jackson's guns could hurl more than 200 pounds of exploding iron shot and shell at the foe. Pakenham had just 8 light field pieces. A combined salvo from them fired about half as much. And they were shooting solid shot, which was no good against personnel. They were doing no good whatever, while Pakenham's artillery were all targets once daylight came out in the field to be fired at by the I keep wanting to say the Federals. I'm shifting wars now. To be fired at by the Americans. After about 2 hours of daylight, with the Redcoats almost completely disorganized, General Pakenham mortally wounded, another general mortally wounded, and more than 2,000 killed or wounded British soldiers lying out on the field, the British called off the attack. Jackson had suffered 7 men wounded and 6 killed. One of them, Jefferson's nephew, Isham Lewis. Another victory for the Americans. And across the river, the amphibious campaign to push its way to the bank opposite New Orleans had been delayed as well. It still managed to get within 5 miles of the city when it just ran out of steam. And after the defeat on the other bank, the men were called back and the battle was over. Another win for Jackson. Still, the campaign was not over. Even as the beaten Redcoat army huddled on the field under a constant artillery barrage until nightfall allowed them to escape, half a dozen British warships managed the incredibly laborious process of sailing up the river. Imagine if you're in a sailboat dependent upon the wind and you're going up a river that does this. You never have the wind for more than a couple of minutes before you lose it, and then it's blowing against you. It's a tremendously difficult operation. They actually managed to reach the vicinity of Fort St. Philip, a masonry fort that was guarding New Orleans from the south. If they could take it or bypass its heavy guns, the river would be clear for them to continue on to the city and maybe even redeem the defeat that Pakenham suffered. They began a bombardment of the fort the next day and kept it up for more than a week. But just as Pakenham's artillery had the wrong projectiles to fire, so did the ship's guns. What they needed were the solid shot Pakenham was firing, but all they had were exploding shells, which were virtually no good against a masonry fort. If only somebody had thought to have these 2 wings of the army trade their ammunition, they might have done something. But as it is, they made no impress whatever on Fort St. Philip. And on January 17th, the fleet gave up and made sail again for the Gulf. 2 days later, the British began the tortuous withdrawal through those bayous to the ships on Lake Borgne, and there was a 6th and final win for the Americans. Well, what's really interesting is the way Americans all watched it from afar, both in distance and in time. During this campaign, it could be a month before news from New Orleans just reached Washington. But once it did, there was an ambitious newspaper press that was burgeoning all over the new country at that time, anxious to keep its readers abreast of developments. And they were focusing the nation's gaze on the Southwest. The information didn't come from correspondents as we think of them, but from soldiers and citizens. The way news traveled in those days was that citizens or soldiers wrote letters home. And if you wrote a letter to Plattsburgh, New York, to your parents read the letter, then they took it to the local newspaper editor who published it in his latest issue for others in the area to read. Newspaper editors all engaged in what was called an editorial exchange, in which out of every issue of a newspaper published, they might save 200 copies to send to newspapers all over the country in return for those newspapers sending copies of their issues to them. And then they all just stole from each other, shamelessly. But the news got around in a day before there were such things as press services. So within a matter of some weeks, people from Maine to Georgia were reading anywhere up to 300 or 400 letters that I know were sent out of New Orleans during the course of the campaign. They were incredibly well informed and probably were the first Americans really able to follow a major news event, more or less simultaneously with that event. The whole nation was watching. Well, that had a tremendous influence, not just on what people knew about the battle, but on what they thought about how it was fought and who fought it. Shortly before the Revolution, the author of a very popular book called Letters from an American Farmer asked, "What then is the American, this new man?" His answer harkened back to the British nicknames for Americans, Yankee Doodle and Brother Jonathan. But by the War of 1812, those archetypes increasingly receded to New England. In their place now came another new man, one with no name, but everyone knew him as the marksman, the rifleman, the hunter of Kentucky. He was the Western man. That newspaper coverage left Americans everywhere fascinated with what was to them the West, meaning the region along the Mississippi. It came largely out of misconceptions. A couple of the first letters to get published actually talked about how brave Kentucky and Tennessee soldiers had rejected in hand-to-hand fighting Pakenham's attack on December 28th and January 1st on Jackson's line. Of course, the British Army never got close to that line, but it didn't stop somebody from making up a really good story in their letter to send east, and that started the ball rolling. A few others wrote similar expressions. A few also talked about the artillery and how important it was, because it's the artillery that wins the battle. But this is a young nation, still trying to frame its own image of itself. And a young nation's imagination wanted more than faceless, mechanistic artillerymen serving a bunch of belching cannon. They wanted something more American, something befitting its image of itself. Emotionally, they wanted the battle to be won by an individualistic weapon, a rifle, made deadly accurate in the hands of modern Minutemen, the peerless volunteers of the West. And thus the myth began, innocently enough, fed by ignorance and romanticism, and it captured the American imagination. By January 9th, just the day after the big land battle, one Louisiana cavalryman was already writing that Kentucky riflemen did tremendous execution and that many of them scarcely fired a gun without bringing down not one but two of the enemy. Now, this fellow's a cavalryman. The cavalry were not involved in the battle. He was miles behind the line. Yet he knew that these riflemen were bringing down all these Britishers. The Western riflemen tore the enemy into shreds. 3 days later, a whole sub-literature began just to celebrate one volunteer's marksmanship when he killed a British officer who was 3 feet in front of him. But that was tremendous marksmanship. The nation's press gobbled this stuff up feverishly. Blue Kentucky volunteers on the South Bank who actually ran rather than fight. A week after the battle, are being given credit for having helped to win the battle and being expert riflemen. By the end of February 1815, people at home boasted that the sons of the West had acquired more glory for themselves and their country than was ever obtained by the same number of men in any country. Poem and song would celebrate the incredible victory. Most of it is forgettable. What gripped the country's imagination was a lyric set to an old tune about a maid who hanged herself in her garters after being seduced by a sea captain. Now, this obviously is a great song to build a national anthem around. It was written to be performed by a man, quote, in the character and dress of a Kentucky rifleman. And it's first published simply under the title New Orleans. It began declaring, "We are a hardy, freeborn race." Then it became even more specific to the theme. Yet again, I will not sing. I suppose you've read it in The Prince, how Pakenham attempted to make old Hickory Jackson wince, but soon his scheme repented. For we with rifles ready cocked thought such occasion lucky, and soon around the general flocked the hunters of Kentucky. All the tropes were there in subsequent verses, celebrating what aim we take with our Kentucky rifles. Every man was half a horse and half an alligator. Kentuckians' rifles won the battle, and by inference, the war itself. The artillery that won the battle is not mentioned anywhere in the song. Yet it is one of the most popular American songs for the next 30 years, retitled The Hunters of Kentucky. In 1828, when Jackson ran for the presidency, it was his campaign's theme song. Days after he won the presidency, the song debuted in London and began shaping the English view or vision of America and Americans. And Americans were really ready for this song. Just 2 years earlier, in 1826, James Fenimore Cooper had published The Last of the Mohicans, a story of Hawkeye, his very name redolent of marksmanship and deadly skill with a rifle. In fact, he bore two sobriquets in the novel. The other was La Longue Carabine, the long rifle. So Hawkeye and his gun have been made into a single organic unit somehow. Defenders of the right, steadfast friends, implacable foes, dispensers of certain justice with the rifle, one of the most enduring characters in American culture. That reflected a literature that began to appear within months of the January 8th battle. When history started to appear, they extolled the Western volunteer and reshaped the battle narrative to reinforce current political and cultural values. This is how mythology grows. Though the Baratarians often appeared because they're pretty romantic characters, completely absent from the story are the regular army, the artillerymen, the sailors, the Creoles, the free blacks who fought, the slaves who built defenses. The growing myth gave Westerners a new sense of pride, poising the West to be the powerhouse of American destiny. And so it went for years. When even the press in New Orleans tried to debunk this rifleman myth, nobody cared. They preferred the myth. By 1876, the cowboy, still in his infancy, will be the natural successor of the Westerner. And so ingrained still was the rifleman in the American imagination that with a centennial celebration coming up that year, every state was to make a donation of something or other by way of exhibit for the exhibition in Washington and Philadelphia. Some wag in the press suggested that Louisiana's contribution to the exhibit should be, quote, the squint made by the Kentucky rifleman when he took aim at General Pakenham. But Pakenham was killed by artillery. Prior to 1815, the nation observed only two holidays, February 22nd and July 4th. At first, some used Independence Day as an occasion to commemorate Jackson's victory as well. On July 4, 1815, a Virginian wrote his brother that he and his friends here in Richmond would commence eating and drinking in commemoration of the battle, and he expected before evening to be walking, as he put it, in a curvilineal direction. I've seen some fellas out in the street. They're still at it. Starting in 1816 and for the next half century, January 8th joined the other two holidays, tying New Orleans in Americans' minds to 1776 and making that victory symbolically the last battle of the struggle with Britain and a new birth of liberty. That celebration continued to be held year after year, nationwide, really until the 1850s and the coming of the sectional crisis began to force people to choose sides, and the Battle of New Orleans sort of got left out of Northern celebrations, but it continued to be celebrated in the South. Actually, in 1819, Louisiana had made it an official day of Thanksgiving. With God and Jackson on their side, no wonder these men believed in American exceptionalism. Foreign visitors to America found that January 8th was a constant theme of bragging in that country. They wouldn't stop talking about it. Victory had given Americans a confidence in themselves that neither time nor changing circumstances could diminish. New Orleans securely in hand, the United States was on the road to expanding further across the continent, dominating New World trade, and laying the foundations of empire. Lurking in all of that were hints of a fear that Britain herself might one day become subordinate to the irrepressible Yankees. Inevitably, the same questions occurred to men on both sides of the Atlantic then and since. What if the British had taken New Orleans? Would they be bound by the treaty that had actually been signed back in December to hand New Orleans back, or would they keep the prize? Many Britons expected more than just a temporary conquest and an opportunity to regain dominance over Gulf trade. It still came down to a question of title, and I told you there are many who believed the real title to New Orleans and the Louisiana Territory still belonged to Spain. So if the British had taken New Orleans, perhaps they would turn it back over to Spain, which still suited their purposes. What the Prime Minister in London, Lord Liverpool, would have done is a mystery, but he clearly expected Pakenham to take New Orleans. We know that with certainty, but beyond that, we just can't speculate. What if the war leaders violated the treaty and went ahead and tried to keep a captured New Orleans? If they did so, they risked compromising the honor of the ministries and the Prince Regent who had signed this negotiated treaty with the Americans. Moreover, instructions to keep New Orleans couldn't reach the victors until late March. Remember the 2-month lag in communications? What could happen in those 2 months? Even if Jackson didn't deny the city to the British, early 19th century communications might. It wasn't necessarily that simple. Because what could Britain have done in that period of time before they might have gotten instructions in March to hand Louisiana back to the Americans? Britain is very, very interested in trade, particularly the protection of its mercantile trade, its dominance of mercantile trade around the world. The Americans were beginning to compete with them for the merchant carrying trade. What was the single best port on the Atlantic Gulf Coast? New Orleans. By 1860, it accounted for 80% of all of the tariff income derived from imports in the entire southern coastline. Only New York had a higher rate of importation and tariff duties. It served, if you look at a map, you can see New Orleans handled the trade from everything from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, from western Missouri, from what is now Chicago. Everything had to go through the port of New Orleans. If the British could just stipulate that America can have New Orleans back, but it must remain a free port, that is duty-free, the result could have been a bonanza for the British. A whole host of things, what ifs are of pretty much no value, but the point is there's a lot more possible impact upon the peace if the British took New Orleans, even if they didn't keep it, than we have often assumed. Those questions remain forever unanswerable. That they can be asked, however, steals, I think, the wind from the argument that the battle there was unimportant. The affair at New Orleans is a glorious one, wrote one observer in 1815, but it is indebted to so many accidents for its glory that it may almost be considered a miracle. Indeed, chance did author much of the triumph's narrative, but it didn't matter. The victory shot adrenaline into Americans' confidence in themselves, framing the foundation of a growing set of myths that undergirded these Republicans' views of themselves and their world. One of Jackson's aides saw that clearly in 1817. "When we shall be told we have gained nothing by the war," he wrote, "we will point to our Union, which it has more strongly and indissolubly cemented as of greater importance than anything that has happened since the all-glorious hour our independence was declared." Unity could be fragile, as the aftermath demonstrated, but for a few weeks, Frenchmen, Spaniards, Portuguese, Germans, Italians, Anglos, Indians, and blacks, free and enslaved, overrode their social, ethnic, and political divisions to craft with those outsiders from Tennessee and Kentucky their infant nation's greatest victory. With it came the nascent sense that they were all Americans and had proved it on the plain at Chalmette. Before the first guns ever fired, a new mythology already began to bind them simply because they were there. If the Yankees' confidence and success fluttered, it never left them. In later years, they loved to adopt the myth of impossible victory against incredible odds, a narrative that became almost a religious precept, the cornerstone of their self-chosen image. It was only a short step from that and from the Almighty and the riflemen standing side by side at New Orleans to divine ordination that Americans push west to Nathaniel Pryor's Western Sea. New Orleans found its destiny in the aftermath of victory. The people of the West were ordained to command the trade of the Mississippi. Thanks to geography, Louisiana would be a vital link in a chain binding Atlantic, Gulf, and Pacific. By 1818, Orleanians were boasting of being a new Gibraltar that laughed defiantly at the most powerful invaders. A market revolution was coming, much of it powering the command of the Mississippi that was cemented on January 8th. In a few years, cotton created fortunes, making cargoes that would multiply 1815's handful of steamboats by hundreds, and demanding labor that inflated the enslaved population of the Mississippi Valley sixfold by 1860. New Orleans alone did not build that stairway, but every step rose on a conviction of American exceptionalism and destiny fathered by Jackson's victory. The new man, in Old Hickory's mold, would be the preferred American ideal for half a century until the Civil War. Elements of him, good and bad, adhered tenaciously for the next 150 years. If not necessarily what Americans were, he was what they wanted to be. And the rest of the world gradually fell in love with the idea of him. Victory at New Orleans showed that he would suffer no slights, that he would be taken seriously, that his was a nation of men, common men, who fought most uncommonly well, and that he would win his battles the American way. When first reports of the victory reached Baltimore, the publisher Hezekiah Niles rushed into print with the February 18th, 1815 edition of his popular newspaper, Niles Weekly Register. He made no effort to restrain his elation as he announced the conclusion of the peace treaty and the triumph at New Orleans in the same issue. "Peace is signed in the arms of victory," he crowed. "Who would not be an American?" Thank you all for listening. Any clogged radiators out there?
Do we have any questions?
There's one over there.
If you just wait for a mic, we'll bring one down to you.
I wanted to ask about the origin of the cotton bale used as fortifications.
The question was, what about the origin of the myth that cotton bales were used? Near as I can tell, that really didn't appear until the 1830s. And it first appears, or at least the earliest I have found it, is actually in woodcut or lithographic portraits or pictures of Jackson's line. And some artists apparently just must have figured they used cotton bales. And again, a cotton bale is much more symbolic of the South, particularly Louisiana, than a pile of mud. So it's kind of mythologically, it's a more attractive bale. But I don't know for sure who was the first to introduce that.
You don't hear much about the French involvement down there except for Lafitte. How much were they involved as far as the victory?
Question is about, you don't hear a lot about the French involvement down there with the exception of the Lafitte brothers, and that is greatly exaggerated. As I say, Jean was nowhere near the battle, near as we can tell, and Pierre was on the fringes of it, but at least was involved. There are several local companies of businessmen, one called Beale's Rifles, who are all shopkeepers, lawyers, clerks, that sort of thing. A number of them are Creoles, that is to say, they're men of French ancestry, or maybe some who were born in France who had come to New Orleans, and they are certainly involved. Then there are, I've forgotten now, but I think there are 3, perhaps 4 companies raised from among the male Creole population of New Orleans who are kind of put together into a battalion, who actually participate in one of the most critical spots on the line where they came under very heavy fire from the Redcoats. It's one of the few places where the Redcoat soldiers on January 8th got to the line and almost were able to get a few men up and over the wall. The numbers involved is in the neighborhood of about 800.
I don't need the microphone. Thank you for becoming a formal part of the society.
Sure.
And lending your good name and your time and energy at a point in your life where maybe you didn't have to do that. Also, at this point in your life, why were you motivated to write a book about this battle? Again, you know, it's late in your career. Why was this important?
Gee, I'm not that old. Man does not live by the Civil War alone. I've killed a lot of trees writing a lot of books about the Civil War. And it kind of, I found I liked the variety every second or third book of doing something about a different aspect of American history, though most all of it has still been concentrated in that region that was then known as the Old Southwest. I'm just really interested in early Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and all. And there hadn't been a really thorough book on the on the New Orleans campaign ever. And the few that had come out had not taken advantage of British sources, which are overwhelming in quantity, and the Public Record Office at Kew in outside London. So, and I like to do things that, near as I can tell, nobody has done before. So the research is really all the fun, and there are interesting characters involved, and I like looking at mythology and seeing where it comes from and what it represents about good and bad about all of us. So it was a nice variety. Charlie?
One last question from Charlie. Here we go.
Jack, there are 2 symbols that the U.S. Army uses today. One is the 7th U.S. Infantry Regiment, and then known as the Cotton Bales. And that's a symbol of the Cotton Bales. Second thing is the CIB, the Combat Infantryman's Badge, which is a long rifle. It's a medal that soldiers in the Army wear with great pride. It points out the importance of the rifle.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
And mythology won after all. Thank you all again very much for listening.